So the different sources and cycle of stress. So I wanted to talk a little bit about it. So think of an individual who is struggling, especially with autoimmune condition. It takes a long time sometimes to be diagnosed with any type of autoimmune condition. So we go through a phase of just stressing out about trying to figure out what is going on, why are we sick, what exactly is happening. You go from doctor to doctor, you refer back and back, financial stress begins to kick in, mental stress begins to kick in because now I'm tired of going back and forth to doctor and doctor. And then that just makes things negative for your overall health. So you have the negative effect making your overall health worse. Then you come and you get diagnosed with it. Gives you a little bit of a relief because now you have a diagnosis to work with. But then you have the chronic stress of living with that specific diagnosis, living with that autoimmune condition. And what that does, again, it starts to suppress our overall health. It makes things worse and it becomes an additional stress again. So it just sort of creates that cycle of stress that continues to go and go and go and go until somewhere along the line that we have to find things to help us break that cycle of stress and do things that would give us a chance to get out of being stuck in fight or flight. So in terms of connecting the stress response to our immune health, again, we talked about one of the reaction is changes in eating pattern, right? Slow digestion as a result of the cortisol and being stuck in fight or flight, or just having that fight or flight response as the case might be. So when our eating pattern changes, when we don't eat properly, when we have slower digestion, we have poor nutrient absorption. So our immune system needs proper nutrition and nutrients in order to function optimally or effectively. So some of these things could include vitamin A, D, C, E, B6, B12, folate, zinc, iron, copper, and selenium, right? So if our body is unable to absorb it because of poor digestion, because of the poor choices in the food that we eat, or just not eating at all, then that would create a response on how our body's immune system would be functioning. So again, poor digestion, there's a link between our gut flora digestion and our immune system. So if we're not taking in the proper food and nutrition, if we're not eating things like that are more beneficial to our good bacteria, then you would have dysbiosis within the gut itself, and you would have more bad bacteria multiplying, overcoming the good bacteria that we need. And then as a result, that could eventually affect our immune system. Again, creating inflammation. Our body recognizes these bad bacteria, and the immune system is the one having to respond to it, right? So then think of 70% of our immune system is basically in our gut, right? So it's important to understand that aspect of it as well. If we have poor digestion, that means in our gut, the health system in our gut's not good, the environment in our gut's not good. So if 70% of our immune system is based off of how our gut health is, then it would definitely be affected if our gut is not functioning optimally. The next aspect you have to think of is the gut-brain connection. So there are tons of nerves that are directly connected from the brain to the gut. One of the biggest nerve that is actually connected, it's the vagus nerve. So again, when there's a poor gut health or there's an issue in the gut, that vagus nerve would be constantly activated. And there's that constant stimulation between the gut and the brain that something's wrong, something's off, we have to do something, right? So you put yourself into sort of a hyperactive nerve at that point in time, constantly trying to stimulate and activate that specific nerve. Next here is the neurotransmitters. So serotonin and Gaba are two things that are produced in the gut. So 90% of the serotonin that our body needs or produces is made in the gut. And serotonin is basically our happy, feel-good hormone. So if our gut's not functioning properly because of the stress, then we're not producing as much serotonin. So our mood of being happy and feeling good starts to become less because we're not producing sufficient amount of serotonin. The next neurotransmitter is GABA, that is also produced largely in the stomach, in the gut. So GABA basically controls fear and anxiety. So again, if our body is unable to produce these things to control these different emotional reactions, then you would continue to have problems with dealing with the fear and the anxiety. You would continue having more of a depressive feeling because you don't have that happy feel-good hormone to sort of counteract that depressive feeling. When we're stressed out, our sleeping patterns changes significantly. Again, sometimes to the point of insomnia. Our body needs to rest in order for it to be able to recover well. When we sleep good, we feel good. Same thing with our immune system. When we're sleeping, our immune system gets an opportunity to sort of heal itself and recover, as the case might be. So when we're unable to sleep properly, then it's going to affect how our immune system reacts as well. Then there's the idea of constant stimulation leading to burnout or fatigue. So with stress, with chronic stress, you're constantly hyper alert, you're constantly on the go, you're constantly trying to figure out what is a threat, what's not a threat, what do I need to do to survive. So under that constant stimulation, again, going back to the idea of tank of water, if you're not refilling that tank and you keep using from that tank, even if it's a bucket every hour, right? Eventually the tanks go into run low. Eventually our energy levels go into burnout. We go into start feeling fatigue. So with constant stimulation, you have that redirection of resources to support survival. Because what happens when stress kicks in, when the traumatic event occurs, we go into survival mode. We're developed to survive. So our body's first instinct would be to redirect all our necessary resources to support survival. So over time, you would start getting less energy. You get less resources to support your immune system, and it could result in a weakened immune function. Not necessarily destroying the immune system or stopping the immune function, but it weakens the immune function in terms of the way that it should react, whether it needs to stimulate to produce more things or to have that feedback loop to say, all right, we fixed whatever was going wrong, we could stop producing X, Y, and Z to support that immune function in that given case. Again, constant stimulation can reflect also into the immune function as a survival mechanism. So a heightened immune response, because the body recognizes the immune response as important for survival. So this is cases of, a lot of times you could see this with that autoimmune condition where you sort of go in that autopilot aspect of it. Your immune system's constantly stimulated because it believes that something's wrong and the immune system's the one to try to protect the body. So it has to constantly respond to various stressors. Again, constant stimulation kicking in the immune function and creates a sort of survival mechanism there. And it keeps you in that autopilot aspect of it. Again, we talked a little bit about the chronic inflammation from stress response. So systemic inflammation creates an environment for secondary health conditions. So things like diabetes, heart disease, some of the more common things. Again, once inflammation's there, it would affect the way that we'll be able to digest food, the way we'll be able to absorb nutrients, etc. So again, chronic inflammation does create a secondary or create space for secondary health conditions, both on the mental health aspect of it as well as physical health aspects of it. A lot of time when we're under constant stress, we begin to have a negative outlook on life and health. So when we have a lack of motivation to help ourselves, that becomes an added stress to us, and that becomes an added stress to those around us. When that becomes an added stress to the people around us, sometimes our support system around us becomes weakened. So when we could have depended on family members and friends to help us, they also become drained by trying to support us. And when we lose our motivation, they around us sometimes would start losing motivation because of that. And because they also would start being drained because of the stress of having to constantly go and trying to help and support the system. So again, I touched a little bit on this before, the autopilot aspect of PTSD. You could almost equivalent it to the autopilot of being in an autoimmune condition, right? You're stuck in survival mode and you're on fight or flight because of PTSD. and the immune system decides that, hey, something's affecting us as an individual, our immune system needs to constantly respond. Like we've mentioned in the introduction, that I served 6 years in the military. I had one tour in Iraq and Kuwait. When I came back home, I had struggled sort of settling back in, going back into school and settling back into school, settling back into civilian life as it's called, right? What happened to me was that every time I pretty much was on autopilot coming back from deployment. So I needed to be constantly on the go. And between school and the military, it kept me busy. But whenever I had a downtime, I would break out in hives. And come to find out, it really was because of this, because my body was on that constant autopilot system where as soon as you get rest, your body feels like something's wrong. So it needs constant stimulation. So I would constantly break out in hives. The only thing I could do is I needed to be active or I needed to go to sleep to shut it down. It would stop. The next day I would go back to school. I'd be busy all day with school, clinic, the military, taking classes, taking extra work and stuff like that. That just kept me busy. And the second I went home and I stopped at home and I started relaxing, automatically hives would break out again. Even with changes of environment, the same thing happened. I came home to visit my parents, the same exact thing would happen. So again, this is just an example, and this is a personal example of where that stress response sometimes kick into the immune system and it creates that autopilot of response. So whenever we go through life, there's different points in life that we could actually experience different types of stress and trauma. So I like to refer to the trauma and stress line of life, right? So during infancy, we're exposed to different types of trauma and stresses. During childhood, same thing. During adolescence, during adulthood, we're exposed to different types of trauma and stresses. We also have with us the effects of transgenerational trauma, which trauma that has been passed down from generation to generation. And then we have additional trauma and stress that we have exposure to within our everyday life that we don't typically classify as a stressful thing or a traumatic event. Right? So whenever I talk about trauma and mental health, I like using the analogy of a boiling pot. So think of yourself as the pot. Your emotions and your mental health becomes the water inside the pot. All our past traumas from the stress timeline basically is the cover for the pot, right? So all our past traumas becomes the cover on the pot, and all our present traumas, and I write here also future trauma, being like the constant fire under us. So we go through every day, we have our regular everyday stressors that we go with, so that fire constantly burns. We have things that happen within our life, unexpected events, different type of traumatic event, be it man-made, natural disasters, car accidents, different things that could create different response. Sometimes listening to the news becomes an added stressor and an added traumatic event for us. So that constant fire is under us all the time. So if we've never processed any of our traumas in the past, it becomes like added weight to the cover on the pot. So now think of the pot cover being too heavy to lift or being too heavy to accommodate the pressure of the boiling water. Because as we know, when water boils, it eventually converts from liquid to gas. With that, pressure increases inside the container that it's boiling. So as we see steam would be released, that's basically the pressure being released, right? But if the cover on top of the pot's too heavy for us to lift off and to create that space for release, eventually the pressure within the pot becomes so much that it becomes more and more explosive, as the case may be. So that's why sometimes you would see an individual who seems perfectly calm just snap out of the ordinary. And sometimes it's because of all the trauma and the stress that that person has been encountering became too much. And then some little thing in that one day or given time becomes a explosive trigger for that individual, because now he has or she has too much of pent up emotions and issues that they haven't dealt with, and it needs to come up. So again, become an explosive on that specific event.